He thought she was disposable. She walked out quietly, carrying a secret he never cared to ask about. 25 years later, that secret walked into his boardroom and brought his empire to its knees. Welcome back to Mr. Charles Stories, where every story doesn't just entertain. It teaches, it heals, and it reminds us of what truly matters. If you've ever been left behind, underestimated, or walked away from someone who couldn't see your worth, this story is for you. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone walk away, only to realize too late what you lost? Have you ever rebuilt yourself in silence while they thought you disappeared? If yes, you're about to feel this one in your soul. Today's story is about Serafina, a woman pushed out of a loveless marriage by a man drunk on ambition. She didn't fight. She didn't plead. She left with quiet strength and a growing life inside her. Her son, Lennox, never knew the man who abandoned them. But he grew up watching his mother rebuild from nothing. He learned her patience, her calm, her fire. Years later, when the world knew him only as the mysterious force behind one of the most strategic business moves in tech history, one man recognized the last name on the merger. That man was his father. This isn't a revenge story. It's a story about presence, legacy, and what happens when the truth doesn't knock. It walks in with quiet power and flips everything. So lean in. This one builds slow, but when it hits, you'll feel every word. If you've ever believed that silence can be stronger than rage, tap subscribe, hit like, and stay with us. Because today, we're telling a story that proves you don't have to destroy someone to win. You just have to outlive their version of you. Let's begin. Charleston in summer smelled like jasmine and rain. The street lamps cast golden halos over cobblestone roads, and everything moved slower. Except Callan Duvall. He stepped into the boutique strategy firm with his signature silver cufflinks glinting, and his voice already 2 steps ahead of everyone else's pace. Serafina adjusted the collar of her blouse and glanced at the glass door as it closed behind him. She'd heard of Callan before. Everyone in the industry had: real estate magnate, 2 towers in Manhattan, a hotel project underway in Atlanta. Reputation? Brilliant. Ruthless. Unavailable. The senior consultants circled him fast, shaking hands, offering coffee, dropping credentials. But Callan's attention drifted past all of them to the intern at the edge of the room. She wasn't trying to be seen. That's what made him notice her. Her nameplate read Serafina. She wore beige linen pants, a pale blue silk top, and a tiny gold pin with no meaning. Just something her grandmother left her. She didn't shift in her seat. She didn't smile at him. She just flipped through briefing documents like she belonged there. He watched her during the presentation. Her slides were clean. Her words were simple, sharp. She didn't embellish or chase approval. When asked what kind of lifestyle the client's luxury project should evoke, she said, warm, but earned. He raised his brows. After the meeting, he waited in the hallway, watching everyone spill out with fake laughs and forced charm. She was the last to leave. "You're wasted here," he said. Serafina blinked, unsure if it was a compliment or a warning. "I'm learning," she replied, "from people who don't see what you are." She tilted her head, still not impressed. "What do you see?" Callan didn't answer. He smiled, walked off, and left his card with reception. A week later, she received an email with a dinner invite. It was formal. No pleasantries. Just a time and place. Serafina hesitated before replying, but curiosity answered for her. They met at a quiet rooftop restaurant. He didn't ask her favorite color. He didn't talk about childhood. Instead, he asked what kind of legacy she wanted. "I haven't thought about that," she said honestly. "You should." By the 3rd dinner, they were no longer speaking in hypotheticals, and by the 5th, they were no longer meeting in public. It was all very fast, secret, sharp-edged, and still, something about it felt inevitable. He was twice her age. She knew that. He was calculating, controlled. Everything in his world was a chess move. But when he looked at her, it was like she was the one thing he hadn't planned for and didn't quite know what to do with. So when he asked her to marry him on a quiet Sunday and offered no ring, no speech, just a folded document and a city hall appointment, she surprised herself by saying yes. The courthouse was almost empty that morning. The clerk barely looked up when she slid the signed license across the desk. There were no photos, no ring box, no bouquet, just a signature and a nod. Callan Duval didn't even button his blazer for the occasion. He stood beside her, hand in pocket, checking his watch while the judge read the vows. Serafina didn't mind. She had told herself this was what she wanted. Simple, no drama, no grand spectacle. But deep down, it didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like a contract. They walked out as husband and wife, but he didn't reach for her hand. He didn't glance her way as the door shut behind them. She glanced sideways at him, trying to imagine what other brides were doing in that moment. Laughing, kissing, maybe crying from joy. She blinked the thought away. The flight back to Atlanta was just as quiet. They sat across from each other on his private jet. She nursed a glass of water. He typed on his tablet with one hand, thumbing through emails, giving occasional short replies to his assistant. The only sentence he said in the entire 2-hour flight was, "There's a dinner next week in New York. You'll need something formal." She nodded. That was how it began. The penthouse was a museum, cold floors, tall windows, minimalist furniture that looked as if no one had ever used it. She found herself walking slowly through each room, as if stepping too hard would crack the surface. There were no family photos, no dusty bookshelves, no spare blankets. Everything was monochrome, like he wanted to avoid color because it might invite warmth. Serafina moved in with only 2 suitcases and a small box of books. No wedding gifts, no letters, no flowers to press between pages, no journal to record the day. But she still told herself it was fine. She placed a small vase of tulips on the marble countertop. Callan walked past it twice and said nothing. That night, she made dinner. Lemon roasted chicken, garlic potatoes, wilted spinach. He didn't show up. At 10 p.m., she placed a foil wrap over the plate and sat on the couch alone, flipping through a magazine she couldn't focus on. The food went into the fridge untouched. It became a pattern. Every day, she tried something small. A home-cooked meal, a warm lamp in the corner, a handwritten note in his briefcase that read, "Breathe." He noticed none of it. When people saw them at galas, they whispered about how elegant she was, how rare it was for someone so young to hold her own beside Callan Duval. She learned to smile through those nights, nodding politely, knowing full well no one saw the truth. He never touched her in public, never leaned in for a private word, never smiled at her with familiarity. She was a wife by title only. One night after a fundraiser in Midtown, she asked him directly, "Do you ever think about kids?" Callan didn't look up from the mirror as he pulled his cufflinks off. "I'm raising companies, not children." He said it like a fact, like numbers on a spreadsheet. She didn't reply, just turned off the lamp and slid under the covers, eyes wide open until morning. Months passed. She added touches of softness to their space, a plush throw blanket here, a warmer hue on the wall, a chair in the sunniest corner for reading. Still, Callan barely acknowledged her presence. He'd travel for days without notice. When he returned, he brought no souvenirs, no stories, only silence. And yet, Serafina stayed, not because she was naive, because she remembered how he had first looked at her, because there was a time when his silence felt curious, not cruel, because part of her still hoped there was something buried under the armor. So she set the dinner table for 2 each evening, and waited. But slowly, the emptiness began to echo louder than his absence. Some days, she found herself scrolling through news articles about emotional neglect. Other nights, she sat on the balcony, watching cars on the freeway, wondering what her life would have looked like if she hadn't said yes. She tried to talk to him once, after a board dinner. "I miss us," she said quietly. "There's nothing to miss. You're here, aren't you?" He wasn't being sarcastic. He meant it. That was what stunned her the most. He truly didn't see the absence of love as a problem. Then came the morning, everything ended. It was cloudy. Rain tapped against the windows. She walked into the kitchen barefoot, wearing one of his shirts and brushing a strand of hair from her face. Callan was already dressed. He stood by the island counter with a manila envelope in hand. Without emotion, he pushed it across the counter. "What's this?" she asked, eyeing the document but not touching it. "I've outgrown this," he said. No pause, no apology, just those words. The silence between them became suffocating. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She opened the envelope, read the contents, straightforward divorce papers, and felt something inside her click. Not break, just shift. She signed them that afternoon. No back and forth, no drawn-out negotiation. One bag, 2 pairs of shoes, one last look around a penthouse that never felt like home. He didn't ask where she'd go. She didn't offer to tell. Serafina took a car to a hotel across town, checked in under her maiden name, sat on the bed and looked out over the city with tired eyes. She wasn't sure where she'd live next, but she knew she'd be free. That night, in the hotel bathroom, she sat on the edge of the tub with a small pregnancy test in hand. Positive. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She placed one hand on her stomach and whispered something no one else would hear. "I've got you. We're going to be okay." Seattle was quieter than Atlanta. It didn't try to impress. It didn't push for attention. That's what Serafina liked most about it. The cloudy skies felt honest, the buildings humbler, and the city itself didn't demand anything from her. She arrived with 2 suitcases and a name that no longer belonged to her. The hotel lobby where she checked in was modest, but clean. As she scribbled Serafina Ray on the guest card, she paused, just for a second. Ray, a name no one had ever called her, a name she chose for the version of herself that would survive this. Callan would never think to look for her here. He wouldn't care. He likely had a team erasing her from his life already. Papers filed, locks changed, her name struck from every document. But none of that mattered anymore. She had her savings, a handful of former colleagues who respected her, and now, a reason to wake up every morning. She was pregnant, and she was going to keep it that way. Her first priority was finding work. She wasn't going to live off what Callan gave her during the divorce settlement, which wasn't much considering how fast she signed. That had been her choice. No legal fights, no drawn-out court appearances, just clean separation. She took on freelance consulting under the name Ray Strategy Collective, advising small tech startups and boutique service brands. The pay was lean at first, but she built a reputation quickly. Clear thinker, fast turnarounds, no nonsense. She handled meetings in the day and researched hospital options at night. At her 10-week checkup, the doctor said the baby was strong. "You're healthy, resilient," he told her, smiling at the monitor. She smiled too. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't forced. Serafina's pregnancy wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, like everything else in her life. She found a small apartment near Green Lake, filled it with second-hand furniture, and stuck notes to the wall that read things like, "You don't need more, you just need peace. Build slowly." He's not your ending. She didn't talk about Callan, not even to herself. She took morning walks with one hand resting on her stomach, promising the growing life inside her that it would know only warmth, only effort. Not cold offices, not quiet kitchens. She never asked for help. She never looked back. The baby came one rainy night in March. She named him Lennox. He had soft curls, large eyes, and quiet strength. Even as a newborn, he didn't scream for attention, just stared up at her with calm intensity. The nurses said he was unusually still, observant. Serafina held him in the hospital bed and whispered, "You're mine. You're my new reason." There were no flowers in the room, no husband pacing the floor, no grand announcement, just her and her son, and it was enough. The early months were hard. She nursed Lennox while sending out client proposals. She paced the room with him on her shoulder while reviewing spreadsheets. She took meetings on mute with a baby swing rocking behind her, but she never complained. Her firm grew, Small clients became steady clients. She built a team of 2 remote assistants and a junior strategist. She trained them carefully, always watching, always patient, always honest. By the time Lennox turned 4, she had 10 long-term clients and a consistent monthly income. She wasn't rich, but she was steady. And in that steadiness, she healed. Lennox grew slowly and deliberately. He didn't speak early, but when he did, his words were clear and careful. At 5, he was reading quietly on the couch, while other kids still stumbled over letters. He asked questions, not many but deep ones. Why do we live here and not somewhere fancy? Why do you always check numbers twice? Why do you work more than the other moms? Serafina always gave honest answers. Because peace is more important than flash. Because mistakes cost more when you're alone. Because no one is coming to save us, baby. So I have to make sure we're always ready. One night, after dinner, he looked at her across the table and asked the question she had been waiting for. Do I have a dad? She took a breath and walked around to sit beside him. You had a father. He didn't want to be one. But you're not missing anything. You have me. Lennox nodded once. Then he picked up his toy car and moved it along the table like the conversation never happened. But it had, and he never asked again. By the time Lennox was 9, Serafina had moved their small firm into a proper office downtown. She gave it glass walls, white oak desks, and a green sofa in the waiting area that Lennox picked out himself. When he came by after school, he'd sit in the corner with a book or a notepad, listening while she held meetings. She didn't notice it at first, but he was always watching. He never interrupted, but he remembered everything. At 12, he built a budgeting sheet for her that worked better than the one her assistant had been using. At 14, he helped a client restructure a presentation deck without being asked. At 15, he showed her a pitch idea he'd drafted, for fun. It was cleaner than anything her team had produced, and Serafina saw it clearly then. He had it. Not just talent, but vision. Calm. Composure. He had her fire, but none of Callan's cold. She never said his name to Lennox. Never once. But the resemblance grew clearer each year. Same jawline. Same posture. Same way of holding eye contact without flinching. Still, Lennox didn't know the full truth, and Serafina wasn't ready to tell him. Not yet. Not while he was still becoming his own man. She taught him how to ask the right questions, how to pause before answering, how to say, "Let me think about that," instead of rushing into opinions. He learned to listen more than he spoke, and when he spoke, people listened. He wasn't a boy trying to be noticed. He was a boy preparing for something. She didn't know what yet, but she had no doubt. It would be something bigger than both of them. Lennox didn't smile often, but when he did, it meant something. He wasn't cold. He was measured, quiet, but always watching. By 16, he had taught himself to code. Not from a class, not from school. He watched online lectures late at night, earbuds in, eyes sharp, soaking up every line of logic like it was language. Serafina didn't force him into anything. She never said, "Be great." She said, "Be useful." That was her creed. She said it on long drives, short walks, while cooking. Be useful, Lennox. People forget charm. They remember who showed up. He absorbed it all. At 17, Lennox launched his first product, an app that helped freelancers create legally sound contracts, track deliverables, and collect payments. He called it Anchor. It was practical, simple, unflashy, just like him. He pitched it at a local tech incubator's student showcase. Most of the kids came in flashy hoodies and sneakers, loud presentations, humor, flair. Lennox wore a plain grey shirt, black jeans and no slides. He just spoke, clearly, calmly, and the panel paid attention. He didn't win the top prize, but 2 of the judges pulled him aside and said, "We want to help you get this into the real world." Serafina helped him register the company in her name, not because he was underage, but because she wanted to protect him from the weight of exposure. She knew how fast attention could twist a person, how quickly power made people hungry, not careful. "I don't want you to grow too fast," she told him. People build fast when they want to be seen, but they build slow when they want to stay. Lennox nodded. He didn't chase speed. He chased clarity. Anchor gained traction among writers, designers, virtual assistants, anyone who worked alone and needed structure. It didn't blow up. It didn't go viral. But it stuck. Quietly. The best kind of growth. Lennox started bringing in passive income. He used it to build a small team, remote like his mother's. Developers, a project manager, a legal consultant, all under Serafina Ray Enterprises. They never used the name Duval. One afternoon, while reviewing potential investors, Lennox heard two interns in the outer office chatting. They were gossiping about a famous real estate tycoon who had divorced a young wife years ago and coldly iced her out with no settlement. They mentioned the name, Callan Duval. One said, "It was brutal. She just vanished. But she was sharp, too. I think she moved out west." Lennox didn't react. But that night, in the quiet of his room, he opened his laptop and typed the name into a search bar. There he was. The man with his eyes. The man who had never once crossed his mother's lips. He scrolled through article after article. Towers, hotels, mergers, a known name in Manhattan, now expanding south. Pictures revealed everything. Same stance, same mouth, same brow. Even the same tilt of the head in photos. There was no question. This was his father. But Lennox said nothing to Serafina. Not because he was afraid, but because he wasn't ready to know what she might say. She had built a life so carefully, so intentionally, and she had done it without bitterness. If he asked her about Callan now, she might answer. But he didn't want facts. He wanted to understand what to do with them, and that part he needed to figure out on his own. He started paying attention to the Duval portfolio, not obsessively, not like a son seeking approval, more like a builder reviewing the foundation of a house he didn't want to live in, but knew he'd have to walk through one day. Callan's empire was aging. Strong, but stiff. It relied on prestige, not innovation. Lennox began noting the gaps. Startups Duval Enterprises ignored, talent they passed over, companies they dismissed as too small. He started mapping those names and calling them. At 19, Lennox quietly acquired a small strategy firm in Los Angeles, then another in Portland. He didn't use the name Anchor. He created a new shell entity, Windcrest Strategies. No public profile, no interviews, no photos, only results. He didn't speak at expos. He didn't brag on panels. He sent proposals with clear numbers, delivered early, and followed up himself. Clients grew. The name began to circulate in whispers. They're efficient, quiet, but they win. Serafina noticed the growth. She didn't stop him. She saw his eyes, the way he studied balance sheets at midnight, the way he asked more questions than he answered. She knew what he was becoming, but she also saw something else. He wasn't becoming Callan. He was becoming something Callan couldn't even recognize. At 21, Lennox was invited to an exclusive investor summit. He attended under his new business name. The hosts had no idea who he was, just that his firm had doubled the growth of 4 startups in 18 months. He walked into that room in a plain navy suit, no jewelry, no logo. When Callan Duval entered that same room an hour later, Lennox stood just 20 feet away. He didn't approach him, didn't speak. He just watched, and in that moment, he understood something critical. Callan had no idea what power looked like when it wasn't loud. Back in Seattle, Serafina was closing up her office when Lennox returned early. "You're home," she said, surprised. "I thought the summit lasted all weekend." "It did. I got what I needed." She raised an eyebrow. He sat across from her, calm, fingers laced. "Do you think a man can build an empire and still lose everything?" She looked at him closely, setting her pen down. "Yes," she said, "if he builds the wrong kind of empire." He nodded once, satisfied. She didn't ask what prompted the question. She didn't need to. She had always trusted him to carry what he found, quietly, like she did. That night, Lennox rewrote his firm's mission statement. It began with 3 words: legacy requires presence, and under it, he added a single name: Ray. No middle name, no initial, just Ray. Because while the world didn't yet know who raised him, soon they would. She walked away with nothing but her name, but she gave her son everything he'd ever need. Have you ever stayed silent, only to come back stronger? Do you know someone building a life from quiet strength? This isn't just a comeback story. It's about building power without noise and legacy without apology. If you believe in the kind of growth that speaks for itself, tap that like button, drop a comment below, and make sure you're subscribed. Because the next chapter, he's not just watching anymore, he's starting to move. At 23, Lennox didn't party. He didn't chase headlines. He didn't post selfies in luxury suits or flash watches in press interviews. He read balance sheets like other people read fiction. He treated silence like a tool. He hired lean, built quietly, tested long, moved when no one was watching. Wincrest's strategies had expanded to 4 cities by now: Seattle, Austin, Denver, and quietly, Manhattan. Every client signed NDAs. No one outside the firms knew who was behind it. But word still got out. Founders spoke in whispers. There's a team that doesn't ask for spotlight. They ask the right questions. They don't sell growth. They create systems for it. Behind closed doors, Lennox Ray sat at his desk, calmly reviewing the firms his mother once told him to study, not follow. Duval Enterprises was still running, still wealthy, but not innovating. Callan's empire, once driven by foresight, now relied on history, on brand name, on aging partnerships. Lennox saw it clearly. Callan had expanded fast, too fast. He'd stacked investments on shaky timelines, acquired firms for headlines, and ignored anything that didn't scream scale. But Lennox? He was a strategist's son, and his empire would be built without noise. He spent a year doing one thing no one else was patient enough to do: listening. He sat in on founder calls without speaking. He reviewed old audit records from failed partnerships. He flew out to meet overlooked companies in cities too small for attention. He asked the same question to each one: what did they promise you that never showed up? By the time he turned 24, he had 36 names on a private list, companies that Duval Enterprises had passed over, rejected, absorbed, and ignored. To Lennox, these weren't scraps. They were the foundation. Meanwhile, Serafina watched her son from a respectful distance. She still ran her boutique firm, still took walks in the early morning before clients started calling. But her pace had slowed. Not because she was tired, but because she no longer carried the same burden. Lennox had become the man she hoped he would be: measured, kind, fierce in the quietest ways. And though she never said it, she knew what he was building. She knew where his eyes were set, but she never tried to stop him. She had raised him to think for himself, and whatever he was about to do, she knew it wouldn't come from bitterness. It would come from clarity. One evening, Lennox returned to the Seattle apartment they still shared when he wasn't traveling. He found Serafina on the balcony, a soft knit blanket over her shoulders, tea in hand. He stood beside her, both of them watching the city lights flicker between patches of mist. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly. She turned slightly, waiting. "Why didn't you ever tell me his name?" Serafina didn't flinch. "Because I didn't want you to carry something that was mine to heal from." He nodded. "I found out anyway. I figured you did." He looked at her, the line of his jaw sharp under the porch light. "I'm not angry. I didn't think you would be." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't tense. It was shared. "You knew I'd go after him," he said. She finally turned to face him. "No," she said softly. "I knew you'd outgrow him." The next day, Lennox flew to New York, not to confront Callan, to prepare, because it was time to make a move. And it wasn't personal, it was structural. He began with Ferrin Partners, Callan's long-standing East Coast competitor, a firm always in his shadow. always trailing Duval's headlines by a step. But Ferrin was stable, cautious, and tired of losing contracts to louder names. Lennox didn't walk in through the front door. He bought in from the bottom, acquiring minority shareholders quietly, creating layered holding companies that secured influence without triggering alarms. Within 6 months, he owned a controlling interest. Ferrin's CEO stepped down. A new board chair was appointed, someone handpicked by Lennox. No one knew his name, but inside the boardroom people started whispering, "Someone's moving." Quietly, Duval Enterprises noticed the shift. 3 former clients defected to Ferrin. 1 exclusive supplier pulled out of an agreement, citing restructuring. Callan held a private meeting with his executive team. He thought it was a coincidence, a market correction, a temporary sting. He had no idea who was behind it, but someone was, and they were good. Lennox didn't rush the next step. He stabilized Ferrin. He streamlined operations, modernized their tech stack, restructured their service model, and replaced outdated leadership with sharp, forward-thinking operators. He never set foot in the building. Everything was handled through intermediaries. He had no need to be seen. He only needed to be effective. By his 25th birthday, Lennox was ready. He merged Wincrest and Ferrin under a single umbrella. A new name, a new structure, a new identity. Ray Capital. The press release was elegant, direct. 2 industry leaders unite under a strategic new alliance. The firm will operate with a renewed focus on long-term scalability, systems optimization, and underrepresented market integration. The executive founder remains private, as is the firm's policy. It dropped at 9:03 a.m. By 11:17 a.m., Callan Duval was holding an emergency conference call. Callan stood in his office, phone in hand, brows locked in a hard line. The view from the 44th floor showed Manhattan's south skyline, but for once, he wasn't admiring it. His COO was on speaker. "We've confirmed the merger. Ferrin Partners and Wincrest Strategies. The new firm is called Ray Capital. Who's behind it?" Callan snapped. "We don't know yet. Everything's masked behind multiple entities." "Then dig harder." The call ended. Callan stayed where he was, hands clenched, teeth tight. Ray. It wasn't just a name. It was a ghost from a past he thought was buried. He hadn't spoken to or heard of Serafina in decades. Not since that morning when he'd handed her the divorce papers and walked away. No fight, no question. He'd moved on, or so he thought. But now the name was back. Not just spoken, but printed on headlines, leading a merger that posed a direct threat to his portfolio. He searched the press release again. Led by a private executive team, name undisclosed, operations based in Seattle and New York. Seattle. That detail made his chest tighten. He remembered Serafina once mentioning the Pacific Northwest. And Ray. That was the name she used in the marriage paperwork, for her mother's side. He hadn't cared enough to remember it then. But he remembered now. And for the first time in years, Callan felt something unfamiliar, a slow, cold unease. He opened his internal report archive and searched for past interactions with Ferrin. A few deals had been attempted. A joint venture had collapsed years ago due to cultural misalignment. He hadn't thought twice about them since. Now they were growing faster than any firm in his immediate competitive set. Word on the street was they were cleaner, faster, more disciplined. No excess, no scandal, just execution. Callan clicked through to their advisory board. New names, fresh talent, none of them familiar. Except one. Buried in the consultant tier, S. Ray, strategic oversight. It wasn't definitive, but it was enough. He stood up, walked to the corner bar, and poured himself 2 fingers of scotch. The ice hit the glass harder than he expected. Across the country, Lennox sat in a quiet office lined with green plants and unfinished wood. His phone buzzed once. A team member sent a screenshot. "Callan's team is scrambling." He didn't reply. He didn't smile. He simply closed the message and turned his attention to the upcoming board vote to acquire 3 more undervalued firms. The goal wasn't speed, it was consolidation. And Callan's infrastructure? It had cracks. Worse, it had blind spots. That night, Lennox returned home. Serafina was in the kitchen, slicing pears for a salad. She looked up at him once and said, "He knows, doesn't he?" Lennox nodded, setting his keys down. He read the press release. Serafina didn't stop cutting. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing," Lennox said calmly. "I didn't build this to chase him." She wiped her hands and faced him. Her eyes didn't soften. They sharpened, but you knew he'd feel it. Lennox met her gaze. He needed to. The next week, Callan sent a request through a private law firm. It was addressed to Ray Capital, a formal invitation for a meeting. No names, no direct mentions, just a line at the bottom, requesting strategic clarity on recent market realignment. Lennox reviewed it once, closed the document, and said to his assistant, "Set the meeting." But only if he comes alone. 3 days later, inside a minimalist office in Manhattan, floor to ceiling, windows, no branding, just clean lines and silence, Callan arrived. He wore his best suit. He didn't know who he was meeting. Until Lennox walked into the room. Black suit, no tie, calm eyes. Callan stared. He saw the resemblance instantly, not just in the face, but in the way Lennox moved. How he didn't rush, how he didn't offer to shake hands. "How long have you known?" Callan asked, voice low. Lennox sat. "Long enough to understand why I don't owe you anything." Callan looked away for the first time in decades. "I didn't know she was pregnant," he said. "You didn't ask." Callan exhaled. "I was different then. You still are." They sat in silence. Callan leaned forward. "Was this about revenge?" Lennox shook his head. "If it was, I would have used your name. I would have humiliated you." "Then what was it?" Lennox looked him dead in the eye. "This was presence. Yours is loud. Mine is clear." He slid an envelope across the table. Callan hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a single page. A handwritten note from Serafina. "I never needed your apology, but I hope you live long enough to feel what you missed." Callan stared at it. The air between them thickened. Lennox stood. Before he walked out, he said quietly, "My mother gave me strength. You gave me the reason to use it." Callan didn't leave the office for nearly an hour after Lennox walked out. He sat in the silence of the empty conference room, the envelope still open. In front of him, Serafina's note resting like a weight on his chest. The handwriting hadn't changed. Still clean, still elegant, still deliberate. "I never needed your apology, but I hope you live long enough to feel what you missed." He did, right now, in this moment. He felt all of it, the shame, the absence, the silence he once weaponized coming back to define him. No press release, no lawsuit, no loud scandal. Just a presence so precise it left no room for denial. The son he never knew had stripped him down with nothing but timing and clarity. Not revenge, precision, and that made it worse. By the next morning, Callan's staff knew something was wrong. He cancelled meetings, skipped a high-level conference call with investors. His assistant noted that he came in early but didn't leave his office for hours. He sat with old photos, business milestones, building blueprints, articles from Forbes and Business Monthly, but they all looked empty now, like structures without a foundation. He scrolled through social media feeds and business blogs. Ray Capital's name was everywhere, circulating through whispers on Twitter mentioned, with admiration in private newsletters, dissected in financial forums. Still no face attached, no public founder, but insiders had begun connecting dots. Meanwhile, in Seattle, Serafina sat on her balcony, watching the wind move the trees. Her fingers gripped a mug of warm tea. She didn't ask Lennox for updates, didn't ask how the meeting went, but she knew. The way his shoulders had dropped when he came home, the way he kissed her on the forehead, not rushed but slowly, as if closing something. That was enough. In the days that followed, Lennox turned inward, not in shame, in stillness. He moved his calendar to half capacity, held strategic meetings only when necessary, declined media requests, offers to speak, and backdoor buyout proposals from eager investors. He wasn't interested in flash. He never had been. His goal hadn't changed, but something inside him had. He sat across from his team during a quarterly planning session and said, "This company isn't about disrupting. It's about building what's been neglected." One of his analysts nodded and added, "It's already happening. 3 startups we supported have outpaced projections. The ones Callan's firm passed on." Lennox didn't smile, but he allowed himself to exhale. "It's not about beating them," he said. "It's about doing what they won't." Back in New York, Callan walked through his penthouse in the middle of the night. He stood in the kitchen, where Serafina once stood in silence years ago, waiting for him to see her. He hadn't. He never did. And now, 2 decades later, she'd raised a man who didn't need him. He picked up his phone and scrolled to an old contact folder, one that hadn't been touched in years. No number, no email, just her name, Serafina Ray Duval. He never changed it, never deleted it. He stared at it for several minutes before locking the screen and setting the phone down. Some things couldn't be undone. A week later, Lennox received a letter in the mail. Handwritten. There was no return address, but he recognized the writing. Callan's. It wasn't long. Just 4 lines. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve to be called your father. But you've built something I couldn't. That's legacy." No signature. No closing. Just acknowledgement. Lennox placed it in the drawer of his desk. He didn't show it to his mother. Not yet. He wasn't ready to give it weight. Callan didn't recover quickly. His investors noticed. His board noticed. But most of all, he noticed just how brittle everything around him had become. Meetings that once felt like opportunities now felt like performances. He found himself scanning every room, second-guessing each decision, wondering how many others had already lost faith before Ray Capital ever made its move. He had always assumed time would protect him. But it hadn't. It only revealed what he'd failed to invest in: people, loyalty, presence. He had outgrown Serafina, but she had grown someone he would never reach. At home, his penthouse felt colder. For years, the silence never bothered him. It had been his choice, his refuge. Now it felt like a mirror, a reminder of every moment he could have been present, of every dinner he skipped, of every morning he didn't ask questions, of every unopened door. He poured himself another drink and stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching New York bleed orange under the evening sky. His empire still stood, but for the first time, he questioned its roots. Across the country, Lennox wasn't watching Callan. He was building again. Not bigger, smarter. He brought on 2 former founders whose companies had been shut out by Duval's aggressive acquisition model. Instead of offering them pity or capital, he gave them ownership. Shared power. Shared decision-making. "Most people want a seat at the table," he told his team. "But I'm building the house." One evening, Serafina entered his home office while he was sketching out a team integration structure on a whiteboard. She leaned against the door quietly and asked, "Do you feel finished?" He turned, soft lines under his eyes. "No. Do you feel full?" He thought for a moment, then said, "I feel enough." She smiled. "That's what I hoped you'd say." She stepped in and handed him an envelope. "I wrote this for when you were ready." He opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, written years earlier, dated the week she gave birth to him. "Lennox, if you're reading this, it means you've grown into the man I always believed you would be. I want you to know that I didn't keep you from him because I hated him. I did it because I didn't want you to chase someone who didn't see your worth. I didn't want you to look in the mirror and wonder if you were ever enough. You were. From the first heartbeat, I raised you on peace, not war. But if you ever chose to face him, I hope you didn't do it to destroy. I hope you did it to show what clarity builds when pride steps aside. Mom." Lennox folded the letter carefully, chest rising with a long breath. He looked up at her. "You never told me. You never asked." Back in Manhattan, Callan sat in his private study, reviewing quarterly performance reports. The numbers weren't terrible, but they weren't impressive either. A slow bleed. Not from failure, from irrelevance. And he knew it. He hadn't lost because of one bold move. He had lost in the quiet. Over years. Over moments he didn't know he was supposed to show up for. Late one night, he searched for interviews on Ray Capital. Still no founder profile. Still no public statements. But in a quiet blog buried in a business Substack, he found a line attributed anonymously to Lennox. "My mother gave me a name. Not one to use, one to live up to." He closed the browser, set the laptop aside, and for the first time in years, Callan said a name out loud. Not to anyone, not for impact, just to himself. Serafina. It hung in the air, soft and final. The headlines had moved on. Ray Capital was no longer the surprise merger or mystery rival. It was becoming the blueprint. Newsletters analyzed its structure. Business schools studied its model. Startups began mentioning them not just as partners, but protectors. And yet, no founder ever stepped forward. No podcast appearance, no keynote stage, no front-page photos. Still, clients kept signing, because under all the curiosity, the results spoke louder than any public profile ever could. Lennox knew what he was doing. He wasn't interested in being known. He was interested in being undeniable. He didn't inherit a last name. He inherited discipline. Every win Ray Capital earned was structured like a case study, tight strategy, ethical terms, long-term positioning. Clients weren't impressed. They were relieved. One founder said, "You don't feel like they're saving you. You feel like they're teaching you how to stop drowning." That was by design. Lennox believed in presence, the kind that didn't need to scream. At the Seattle office, Lennox had started mentoring a new class of junior analysts. Not formally, just quietly. He'd invite them into strategy reviews, let them observe executive calls, ask for their thoughts afterward. One of them, a sharp young woman named Camille, stayed after a session and asked him a question no one ever had. "Do you ever regret staying hidden?" Lennox looked at her. "I'm not hidden," he said. "I'm focused." She nodded. "Most people need credit to feel seen." "I don't need credit," he said. "I need impact." Then he smiled slightly and added, "But I appreciate the question." Later that night, he stood in the hallway of his mother's home. He hadn't said it out loud yet, but he'd been thinking of stepping back from day-to-day operations. Not to leave, to make room. The foundation was strong. The house was standing. Maybe it was time to let someone else add the windows. Inside the living room, Serafina sat cross-legged on the couch, going through an old box of photos she'd finally taken down from the top shelf. Lennox sat beside her. One photo caught his attention, a small shot of her in her 20s, standing outside an office. In Atlanta, holding a client folder and smiling, like she'd just told the world no, and meant it. "Was that your first client?" he asked. "My third," she said, "but the first one who paid me on time." They both laughed. He stared at the photo. "I've been thinking about stepping back a little." Serafina didn't react with surprise. "Because you feel done?" she asked. "No, because I think I built what needed to exist, and now I want to do what I wasn't raised with." "What's that?" "Presence." The following month, Lennox made a quiet internal announcement. He was transitioning from CEO of Ray Capital to executive chair. He would no longer oversee day-to-day operations. No press statement, no staged photos, just a letter to staff. "I built Ray Capital as a house for thinkers. Now it's time to let new minds take the lead. I'm not stepping back, I'm making room. You don't need noise to make change. You need clarity." Some were stunned, some saw it coming, but no one panicked. Because he hadn't built a brand, he'd built a culture. The first board meeting under new leadership began with a chair left open at the table. It wasn't for Lennox. It was for whoever wanted to ask the next hard question. And when a new strategist sat there and pointed out a risk in a current market expansion, no one silenced her. They listened, Because that's what Lennox taught them. Power isn't held. It's handed over on purpose. Back in Manhattan, Callan read the internal shift in a private investor bulletin. He stared at the name, Lennox Ray, Executive Chair, Founder. He hadn't even known the boy's name until the confrontation weeks earlier. Now it was everywhere. And still, nowhere. No interviews, no quotes, no face attached. Just ripple after ripple after ripple. Callan leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He whispered to himself, he didn't build to be seen, he built to outlast. And for once, he didn't feel envy. He felt respect, and something like regret. One weekend, Lennox and Serafina visited a small coastal town north of San Francisco. It was quiet, blue, private. They stayed in a rented house with no Wi-Fi. They cooked together, walked along the cliffs, didn't mention the company once. On the second night, Serafina asked, "Do you ever want to know him? As a man?" Lennox stirred his tea. "No. I've already met him." She nodded, and that was enough. Before they left, Lennox sat outside on a porch swing and began writing a letter. Not for Callan, for himself. "I used to think legacy was about who remembers you. Now I think it's about what continues without you. I didn't need his name. I had yours. I didn't need his presence. I had your effort. I didn't need to hurt him. I needed to honor what built me." 3 months later, Ray Capital announced the launch of a private foundation, the Ray Initiative, focused on mentoring overlooked founders from non-traditional backgrounds. No fanfare, just action. At the top of the landing page, a single quote: "Build quietly, move with clarity, leave something standing. No attribution." Just those words. And for the people who knew where they came from, that was more than enough. The thing about power is, it fades quietly. Not with explosions, not with scandal. It slips through the cracks, one quiet choice at a time. That's what Callan Duvall learned. At 61, he was still sharp, still well-dressed, still commanding in any room that hadn't watched him fall behind. But behind closed doors, he knew the truth. The machine he'd built didn't run like it used to. The boardroom energy had shifted. The eagerness in his staff's eyes had dimmed. Partners asked more questions now. Some requests took longer to fulfill. And more importantly, fewer were asking for him. They were asking for alternatives, asking for innovation, asking for what Ray Capital represented. He could feel it every time he stepped into a room. It had been nearly 4 months since the meeting with Lennox, since the letter, since Serafina's name returned to the air like perfume that never quite left the fabric. Callan hadn't spoken to either of them. He hadn't tried, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. And that truth burned more than anything. He was a man who had conquered markets, silenced competitors, and grown a reputation out of precision. But he'd never learned how to ask for another chance. Never practiced apology, never learned to make room. So he stayed where he was, watching, carrying a name his son didn't need. One afternoon, he stood in front of his bathroom mirror longer than usual. The man who stared back wasn't broken, but he was hollowed out. He picked up his watch, a custom piece gifted by his board 10 years ago after a major acquisition. He turned it over. The back read, "For building what others couldn't." It felt almost cruel now. He hadn't built people. He had built performance. And people remember people, not projections. That evening, he visited a private art gallery in Soho, a quiet event hosted by a former client. It wasn't for exposure. It wasn't for photos. He needed air, space. The room was full of sculpture pieces, raw, unpolished, half-formed but intentional. There was one in particular that stopped him, a small bronze figure, no head, no hands, just a core. But strong, undefinable, present. He stared at it for too long. The artist walked up beside him, a woman in her 40s with calm energy and silver rings on every finger. "Most people skip that one," she said. Callan nodded. "It's the only one that feels honest." She smiled. "That's why it's not for sale." He nodded once, then walked out into the night with a strange ache in his chest. Across the country, Lennox sat across from his mother in a quiet Seattle cafe, reviewing architectural plans for the Ray Initiative's Mentorship Center. He pointed to a sketch. "I want this room to feel like someone finally made space for them." Serafina smiled. "You've always made space." He paused. "You did first." She shook her head. "I did what I could. You built what I couldn't." Later that day, Lennox received an unmarked envelope at his home. No stamp, no name, just delivered by hand. He opened it carefully. Inside was a small card. On it were 5 words: "Do sons ever forgive silence?" No signature, but he knew who it was. He sat with the card for a long time. He didn't react, didn't crumple it, didn't call anyone. He simply placed it next to Serafina's letter from 25 years ago. Then he turned off the light. Some answers don't arrive immediately. They settle, then they choose their time. The next morning, Serafina found Lennox standing by the window in his home office, holding the card. He didn't speak. She didn't ask. Instead, she poured him a cup of tea and set it on the table behind him. As she turned to leave, he said, "He asked if sons ever forgive silence." She stopped. "He's not asking for your forgiveness," she said. "He's asking for relief." He turned toward her. "What if I don't know what I feel?" "You don't have to." She walked over, set her hand on his shoulder. "You don't owe him an answer. But if you ever want to give one, make sure it's not out of pity." That afternoon, Lennox went for a walk through the city. No destination, no plan. Just thinking. Not about revenge, not about legacy, just about what kind of man he wanted to be. He passed a group of teenagers laughing by a food truck. One of them reminded him of himself at 16. Serious, quiet, absorbing everything. He wondered if he would have turned out the same way if Callan had stayed. Probably not. Would he have been softer, more eager to prove himself? Would he have chased approval instead of learning how to stand alone? He walked into a small bookstore and wandered between aisles. At the back, in the parenting section, there was a shelf marked "Letters Never Sent." It was a collection of real letters, some written to mothers, some to fathers, some to children. He picked one up and flipped to a random page. "You never said sorry. You never said anything. And still, I waited for something. Anything. Until I stopped and started becoming the person you never looked for." He closed the book gently, slipped it back on the shelf, and walked out. By the time he returned home, the sky had dimmed, soft blues giving way to grey. He sat at his desk and opened a blank page. No title, just space. Then he began to write. "Callan, I don't know what you want from me. I don't know what you expect I'll say that will fix the years you spent choosing absence. But I know what I needed. I needed a man who asked questions. I needed a man who noticed. I needed a man who didn't see presence as a burden. And when I didn't have that, I built it. I built it through my mother's effort. I built it through mentors who didn't share blood, but shared their time. I built it through clients who believed in me before they knew my name. You were never part of that. But that doesn't make it incomplete. That makes it mine. You ask if sons ever forgive silence. I don't carry anger, but I won't shrink what I've built just so you feel less empty. You taught me something without saying a word. Silence can destroy, but it can also sharpen. I used mine to become whole." Lennox. He didn't send the letter. He folded it neatly and placed it beside the others. Sometimes the act of writing is the only answer needed. The next day, he visited the construction site for the Ray Initiative's mentorship building. It wasn't a tall structure, just a thoughtful one. One hallway was lined with glass walls that would soon display rotating quotes from mentees and mentors alike. Lennox stood there, imagining the space filled with people, young founders, first-generation entrepreneurs, late bloomers, quiet builders. He smiled. One of the architects approached him. "Would you like us to dedicate a wall in your name?" Lennox shook his head. "Dedicate it to whoever walks in scared and leaves certain." That night, Serafina found a copy of the unsent letter on the table. She read it in silence, then placed it back down and whispered, "He'll feel this, even if he never sees it." Back in Manhattan, Callan stood by the elevator in his office building, holding another quarterly report from a declining sector. But he wasn't reading it. He was staring at the lobby entrance, watching as a young father walked in, holding his child's hand. The little girl looked up at him and said, "Are you going to be at dinner tonight?" The man replied, "Of course. I'll always show up." Callan blinked, then stepped into the elevator alone. No empire could match that sentence, and he knew it. He never asked to be forgiven, and Lennox never needed to be angry to feel the weight of silence. Have you ever been hurt by someone who never apologized, yet still found yourself healing without them? Do you know what it means to outgrow someone without revenge? Sometimes, the loudest revenge is no revenge at all. It's peace, presence, progress. If you believe healing doesn't always need closure, if you've learned to move forward, without the words you never received, tap like, drop a comment, and hit subscribe. Because the next chapter, Lennox makes a choice that speaks louder than anything Callan ever said. Serafina always believed silence wasn't empty. It was full of things that people couldn't bring themselves to say. She had lived through it, been shaped by it, raised her son in it. Now she watched from her kitchen window as Lennox tended to the tiny herb garden they planted together the month he stepped back from Ray Capital's daily operations. It was his idea. "Let's plant something slow," he had said. "Something that doesn't need to be fast to be valuable." That morning, he crouched beside the basil, pulling up small weeds without rush. His eyes were focused, not distant. His silence wasn't about avoidance anymore. It was about peace. Serafina leaned against the counter and thought, "He's healing in the same silence that raised him." Later that day they sat side by side on the porch steps. She sipped her tea. He sliced apples. "What do you think he's doing right now?" Lennox asked suddenly. She didn't pretend not to know who he meant. "Regretting," she said. "Maybe quietly trying to rebuild something no one's asking for." He nodded slowly. "I wonder if I made him small." "You didn't," she said. He shrank when he forgot how to care. In Manhattan, Callan walked into his office and immediately noticed what wasn't there. His schedule had no meetings. Not one. His executive assistant had reached out the day before to say she was moving on. No warning. No transition plan. Just a polite resignation. Callan didn't take it personally. He barely took it at all. He sat behind his desk and opened his laptop. 10 new emails. 3 flagged reports. 2 requests to approve timelines. He no longer had the energy to review. He closed the lid and looked out the window. The buildings no longer looked like triumphs. They looked like placeholders. Callan's days had changed. He didn't attend industry panels. He declined speaking engagements. He wasn't being asked to mentor new founders. His name still held weight, but only in past tense. He went home earlier now, cooked for himself, ate in silence, thought too much, slept too little. There were nights he sat in his apartment and reached for his phone, his hand hovering over it for long minutes. He wanted to call, to ask Serafina something simple, like how she made tea with orange peel, or what book she'd last read to Lennox before bed. But the phone always stayed silent, because even after all this time he didn't know how to speak without control. Across the country, Lennox met with his leadership team at the Ray Initiative. They were reviewing applications from aspiring founders in underserved regions. One application stood out. An older man in his 50s, starting over after a failed business. The team wasn't sure if he was a fit. Lennox read the submission twice. "He's applying not for capital," Lennox said, "but for belief." They added him to the shortlist. The next weekend, Lennox attended a local mentorship roundtable. He spoke for only 15 minutes. No slides, no rehearsed speech, just one message. You're not defined by who noticed you. You're defined by what you notice in others. Afterward, a young woman walked up and said, "You remind me of my dad. But in the ways I wish he'd shown up." He didn't know what to say. He just nodded. And she smiled, like that was enough. Back home, Serafina sat on the porch, staring out into the soft dusk. She had a letter in her hand. No return address, no name. Inside were only 3 words, handwritten in familiar ink. I see now. She folded it slowly, then placed it inside the drawer where she kept the letters that mattered, not because of what they asked, but because of what they admitted. The following Monday, Lennox stood before a group of new mentees at Ray Initiative's pilot program. They were gathered in a clean, sunlit room with glass walls, shared work tables, and a soft hum of nervous ambition in the air. Some were young, some were older. All of them had stories that hadn't been heard. Yet, Lennox didn't give them a speech. Instead, he wrote 3 words on the board: build from stillness. Then he turned and said, "You don't need noise to be powerful. You need purpose." That was it. The mentors took over, and Lennox stepped aside. Outside, Serafina waited with 2 cups of coffee. When he joined her under the trees near the courtyard, she handed him the warmer cup. How she always remembered which one was his, he never knew. "They looked nervous," she said. "They should be," he replied. "They're about to realize no one's going to hand them anything." She took a sip. "Good." He looked over at her. "Do you think I should have told him thank you?" Serafina's eyes didn't blink. "For what?" Lennox looked down at the cup in his hands. "For not being there. Because if he had been, I might have never needed to become this version of myself." She smiled, soft and certain. "That's not a thank you. That's a survival." In Manhattan, Callan walked along the edge of Central Park at sunset. No driver, no staff, just him. It wasn't regret that gnawed at him. It was awareness of everything he'd missed. The dinners, the questions, the sound of a child saying "Dad" and meaning it. He passed a young family sitting on the grass. The boy was laughing at something, holding a paper airplane. His father clapped as the boy threw it again, wildly off course. But no one corrected him. They were just there, together. Callan kept walking and whispered, "I see now." That evening he returned to his apartment and opened his closet. At the back, in a box he hadn't touched in decades, were old papers from the year he married Serafina. A faded program from a gala, a menu from their first dinner in Charleston, a worn manila envelope she'd once written her name on, S. Ray, in small script. He pulled it all out, sat on the floor, and let himself remember something he hadn't let surface in years. She never asked him to be perfect. She only asked him to show up, and he never did. Meanwhile, Lennox was writing again. He wrote late at night, reflections, letters he'd never send, notes on what kind of legacy he wanted to leave if he ever had children of his own. He didn't write about Callan often, but when he did, it wasn't in anger. It was in clarity. You chose yourself. I chose others. You built your empire. I built presence. And when the world forgets our names, mine will still be walking around in those I helped carry. The next morning, Serafina found him asleep on the couch, notebook on his chest, pen uncapped in his hand. She didn't wake him. She simply covered him with a blanket, looked down at her son, this man she raised alone, and thought, "He's not just mine anymore. He's something I gave the world." And for the first time in 25 years, the story of what happened in Charleston didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a root. The Ray Initiative's Mentorship Center opened on a Sunday afternoon. There was no ribbon cutting, no media crew, no speeches, just people, dozens of them, former mentees, new applicants, staff members, advisors, and community leaders, all walking the halls, reading the etched quotes on the walls, checking the glass boards that listed upcoming workshops. Lennox stood near the entrance in a plain grey shirt, speaking with a young man who had driven across 3 states to apply in person. He didn't tell him who he was. He never needed to. Instead, he asked the boy what problem he was trying to solve. The answer was thoughtful, clear, and Lennox smiled. "Let's set up a review call this week. No flair, no validation, just presence." Serafina walked through the building slowly, trailing her fingers along the hallway wall as she moved. Each quote inscribed was submitted anonymously by a mentee, but she knew Lennox had chosen the final one engraved above the main entry. "Start from the silence. Let what you build speak." She paused beneath it, closed her eyes. This was the space her son had created, and it was full of everything Callan's empire never had. Meanwhile, Callan stayed in New York, but he read about the opening in a quiet mention within a local leadership newsletter. No photos, no names, just a line that said, "Ray Initiative opens new mentorship center in Seattle, focused on equity for overlooked founders." Callan traced the sentence with his eyes again and again. There was something devastating about the simplicity. No victory speech, no headline, no drama, just legacy. That same day, Callan took a drive to the edge of town where he kept a property he hadn't visited in years. It was quiet. A one-story house tucked between woods and a lake, bought back when he still thought about family vacations that never happened. Inside, dust blanketed the furniture and old books lined the shelves untouched. He found a journal, not Serafina's, his, from nearly 30 years ago. The handwriting surprised him, neater than he remembered. He flipped through pages until he found an entry marked 2 months before their divorce. "She's drifting. I can feel it. But I don't know how to fix something I never learned to hold." He read the line again, and for the first time in decades, the truth didn't sting. It settled. Because now, he finally understood what he never said, never tried, and never asked. "What do you need from me?" In Seattle, Serafina stood in the mentorship center's shared garden behind the building. Lennox joined her with 2 mugs of tea. "You think it's enough?" he asked. She turned to him. It already was before it opened. He looked out at the new benches, the quiet footpaths, the small pond at the edge of the property. "I've been thinking," he said, "about doing fewer things, like retiring. Not yet. Just giving others the mic." She nodded. "You've earned silence again, this time not as a burden, as a gift." That night, Lennox sat in his apartment, reading submissions for the next mentorship cohort. Most were promising. One stood out. A young man had written, "I was told I wasn't meant to lead, but I know how to follow truth. That's why I'm here." Lennox closed the file slowly. He saw himself in that sentence, and he knew what Serafina had given him, what Callan had failed to provide, what he now gave to others. All of it had led to this, not a name in lights, a name in motion. The next morning, Lennox woke early. The light poured in through his bedroom window in thin gold lines across the floor. Seattle was quiet, overcast, soft. He brewed coffee, checked emails, then turned his phone off completely. He wanted the day uninterrupted. He drove across the city, not to an office, not to a partners' meeting, but to a school. One of the local high schools had invited him months ago to speak to a small business class. He never confirmed. But today, he showed up. No fanfare, no handlers, just a man with a name they didn't recognize, until they started Googling quietly under their desks. The teacher welcomed him in with wide eyes. "I didn't think you'd come." "I don't schedule what matters," Lennox said. "I just show up." The class was quiet at first, teenagers sizing him up, wondering if he was one of those speakers who came to throw cliches and disappear. Then he spoke. "I didn't grow up in a family with power. I didn't inherit an empire. What I inherited was the lesson of being ignored, and I used it. They listened. Everyone talks about what you'll build. No one talks about what you'll carry while you build it." By the end, the questions came fast. "How did you start? Did anyone doubt you? What do you do when your family isn't proud?" He answered each one without a script. And when the bell rang, he shook the teacher's hand, handed one of the students his card, and said, "Tell me what you're working on. I'll read it." Then he left before anyone asked for a selfie. Meanwhile, Callan visited his lawyer's office. Not for business, not for damage control, but to draft something he should have written long ago. His will. He didn't have heirs, no current wife, no other children. Only a son who never bore his name. Still, he wrote, if he ever wants it, the door is open, not for wealth, but for the truth. He signed the papers, and for the first time, his signature felt unfinished. Back in Seattle, Serafina sat by her windowsill with a notebook in hand. She wasn't journaling, just drawing, shapes, lines, slow movements of pen across paper. She hadn't done that in years. She once gave all her stillness to motherhood. Now she was learning what it meant to have stillness of her own. Her phone buzzed. A message from Lennox spoke at a school today. Thought about how you taught me everything important without ever raising your voice. She smiled, replied, that was always the point. That evening, Lennox received a package. No return label. Just a black envelope inside a box. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single object, a small silver cufflink. Engraved on the underside, build quietly, finish loudly. It wasn't signed, but he knew the handwriting etched into the lining of the box. He held it for a long moment, then placed it on his desk, not as a trophy, not as a message, just as a reminder that even those who never showed up might still be learning how. Lennox stood in the heart of a city that never gave him anything, and still he had shaped it. Ray Capital's Seattle headquarters wasn't a skyscraper. It wasn't all glass and steel. It sat low, with wide hallways, tall windows, and quiet corners where people could think. It had no statues, no portraits, only stories. On this particular morning, a new intern walked by him and didn't recognize him. She greeted him with a simple, "Morning." He nodded, then watched her walk into a room he had designed. She would learn his name eventually, but more importantly, she would feel what he'd built. Upstairs, his team was preparing for the quarterly planning session. Nothing about it felt like old corporate culture. No suits, no bosses. Lennox sat on the side of the table, not at the head. He let the younger voices lead. When they turned to him for insight, he gave clarity, not orders. And when the team debated a partnership pitch from a former Duval executive who now worked for a mid-size firm, Lennox listened, waited, and finally said, "Sometimes people come around. But it doesn't mean we circle back. Decision made." They moved forward. Across town, Serafina took her usual walk through Volunteer Park. She liked to go early, before the joggers crowded the path, before the coffee shops filled, before the city remembered to be busy again. She walked slowly, hands in her coat pockets. Sometimes she thought about Charleston. Other times, she thought about her son's first steps in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. But most times, she thought about now. The quiet, the freedom, the absence of urgency. A woman passed her with a baby stroller and smiled. "You look peaceful." Serafina smiled back. "I've earned it." In New York, Callan sat across from a retired business journalist who had once profiled him at the height of his career. They'd met at a quiet bar, tucked inside a hotel lobby where no one asked questions. "You know they're calling your son a new kind of architect," the journalist said. Callan sipped his drink. "He's not my son." The journalist raised an eyebrow. "He was. In biology," Callan continued. "But I didn't earn the title." Silence settled between them. Finally, the journalist said, "There's a story in that." "There's no story," Callan replied. "There's a truth. And I'm the only one who knows what it cost." That night, Lennox sat on the floor of his apartment, a stack of unopened letters beside him. Not fan mail, not requests. Old letters from Serafina. Ones she used to write to herself when he was a baby. She'd once told him, "When I didn't have anyone to talk to, I wrote to the future version of you." Now he was reading them, one by one. "Tonight you had mashed carrots and cried because I didn't warm the bottle just right. I wanted to cry too. But I didn't, because one of us had to stay whole. I miss being seen, but when you look up at me, I remember that I am still here. Your father doesn't know you exist." I don't say that with pain. I say that with power, because I do. I see you. I know every breath. Lennox folded the last one slowly. He understood her better now than ever, not as her son, but as someone who also chose presence. The next morning, a mentor at Ray Initiative pulled Lennox aside. "There's a young man in this new group. Quiet, smart, a little guarded. Reminds me of you." Lennox raised a brow. "That bad, huh?" The mentor smiled. "He's not looking for validation. He's looking for a door." Later that day, Lennox sat in the back of the training room as the young man presented a business idea, something messy, passionate, not fully formed. But underneath the rough pitch was something clear. The kid meant it. After the presentation, Lennox approached him. "You built that alone?" he asked. "Yes," the young man replied. "I can tell. You didn't wait to be noticed." The young man hesitated. "No one's ever noticed me." Lennox nodded. "They will now." Across the city, Serafina hosted a small dinner at home. No special occasion, just family. Lennox, a few of his closest team members, a couple of mentees who didn't have family nearby. She cooked slow, served intentionally. She asked questions no one else did. "How's your sleep? Who do you trust with your hardest thought?" After dinner, one of the mentees hugged her and said, "I wish you were my mom." She smiled. "Honey," she said, "you're in a house she built." That night, Lennox stood in the kitchen drying plates as Serafina wrapped leftovers. "You remember when we didn't have real plates?" he asked. "We had one." "It cracked," she replied, laughing. He looked around the house. "You ever think we'd end up here?" "No," she said honestly. "I thought we'd end up somewhere. I just prayed it would feel like this." He nodded, setting the last plate aside. And in a quiet apartment in New York, Callan walked past the photo of himself receiving an industry award in 2006. He didn't stop to look at it. He walked past the rows of trophies, the rows of plaques. He sat down, opened a blank sheet of paper, and began writing, not for press, but for someone who would never need it. Callan wrote the letter by hand, not because it was poetic, but because he needed to feel the words leave him. He didn't draft it as a businessman. He wrote it as a man trying to understand what was left when legacy didn't recognize him back. There were no rehearsed phrases, no damage control, just lines that bled truth. "Lennox, you don't owe me anything. Not time, not forgiveness, not recognition. I forfeited those things a long time ago. And yet, there isn't a day that passes that I don't wonder what you sounded like when you first laughed, what you needed when you first hurt, what it would have meant if I had stayed, not as an empire, but as a man. You became something I never could, a man who listens, a man who shows up, a man people follow, not because he demands it, but because his silence speaks louder than others' noise. I won't ask for a meeting. I won't ask for a seat. But if you ever want to know who I became after you showed me who I could have been, this letter will be here. Not because I deserve it, but because you changed what I thought was final. Callan." He didn't send it right away. He sealed it, labeled it simply, "in case," then placed it in the drawer beside a faded photograph of a woman in beige, linen pants and a silk blouse, walking confidently down a hallway long gone. He stared at that photo longer than usual, then closed the drawer. Some truths were no longer for publication. They were offerings. Across the country, Lennox sat on the rooftop of his building, watching the city lights ripple across the skyline. Next to him, one of Ray Capital's newest board members sat quietly. She was 32, brilliant, discreet, rising fast. He had mentored her from day one. Now, she ran operations like she had been born to do it. "You're pulling back," she said softly. "I'm shifting," Lennox corrected. "Making room." "For what?" "For life." She nodded, then asked something bold. "Are you ever going to talk to him again?" Lennox didn't flinch. "I think I already did." She waited. "The moment I didn't destroy him, that was the only language I had left." That weekend, Serafina invited a few close friends to a community reading event. It was hosted in the open-air garden behind the Mentorship Center. Poems, excerpts, short essays. People shared stories of origin, of pain, of becoming. She didn't plan to read. But near the end, one of the organizers asked her gently, "Would you like to close us out?" She stood slowly, walked to the front, then unfolded a letter she had once written to Lennox when he was only 2. "I don't know who you'll become, but I know what I'm giving you. I'm giving you the quiet I never had, the attention I always wanted, and the belief that if I fail every other way, you'll still know I stayed." The crowd was silent. not moved by volume, but by stillness. They stood for her as she sat back down, not out of applause, but out of respect. Lennox helped her pack up that night. As they walked to the car, she asked, "You ever think of leaving Seattle?" He nodded. "Sometimes." She glanced sideways. "And I don't think I'm done watching the garden grow yet." She smiled. "Neither am I." Back in New York, Callan stood in his office, a single light on. He reread the letter he'd written, still sealed. Then, slowly, he placed it in an envelope addressed to L. Ray, Seattle office. No return name, just a typed label. He paused, then placed it in the outgoing mail tray. No final note, no expectations, just a quiet offering. One man's proof that he'd seen the mountain and knew he hadn't built it. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. It was placed on the receptionist's desk at Ray Capital's Seattle office just like any other piece of mail, unmarked, ordinary. But the moment Lennox saw the handwriting on the front, he paused. Not because he recognized it instantly, but because of what he didn't see. No signature, no sender, just an envelope that didn't need an introduction. He didn't open it right away. He brought it upstairs, sat with it, set it on the edge of his desk, stared at it, the way someone might stare at the door of a house they once lived in, but never felt at home in. He took a breath, then opened it. The letter was brief, honest, and deeply restrained. There were no pleads, no father claims, no rewriting of the past, just acknowledgement of absence, of failure, of difference. And at the bottom, one line stood alone. "Some things can't be undone, but they can be understood." Lennox read it twice, then folded it carefully. He didn't cry. He didn't scoff. He just placed the letter beside the others. Because healing, for him, had never needed loud answers, only quiet recognition. Later that day, he walked the mentorship garden alone. The sun was low, the light soft. He watched a group of students work through a brainstorming session on the lawn, sketching, arguing, laughing. He saw the joy, the spark, the ambition built without fear. He sat on a bench just outside the walkway, letting the wind speak instead of thoughts. Serafina joined him minutes later. She didn't say anything at first. She saw the letter in his hand and knew. "Was it what you needed?" she asked softly. "No," Lennox replied. "But it was enough." Back in New York, Callan Duvall left his office earlier than usual. He didn't check messages, didn't take calls. Instead, he went home, heated up leftover soup, sat on his balcony and let the city move without him. He thought of Serafina, not as a regret, but as a reference point. She had rebuilt something from nothing. He had chased everything and never built a place to land. And still, she never made a public enemy of him. She never destroyed him. She had simply lived well. That, in the end, had been the loudest answer. At Ray Capital's quarterly team gathering, Lennox stood before his staff. Not as a CEO, not even as the executive chair, just as a man holding a story they had all helped shape. "I used to think I had something to prove," he told them. "Now I realize I had something to protect." He gestured toward them. No one clapped. Not right away. They listened. Because this wasn't a performance. It was presence. After the meeting, a senior team member approached Lennox with a file, a proposal from a real estate firm in New York, formerly tied to Duvall Enterprises. "They want a meeting." Lennox took the file, glanced at it, then handed it back. "Not now. Later, maybe," he said, "when it's not about making a point." That night, Serafina stood on the balcony of her home, a light shawl over her shoulders, sipping tea. Lennox joined her with a quiet sigh, resting both hands on the railing. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He took a long breath. "That I became everything he wasn't. Not because I fought him, but because I followed you." She turned to him. "You didn't follow me, Lennox. You walked ahead." He smiled gently. "I just walked with you." It was nearly dusk when Lennox received the final numbers. Ray Capital had not only surpassed Duval Enterprises in quarterly revenue, they had outpaced them in annual growth, international expansion, and investment value. But Lennox didn't smile for the cameras. He didn't take a victory lap. He closed the reports, leaned back, and breathed slowly. Because this was never about beating Callan. The next morning, Serafina stepped into Lennox's office with a quiet knock. He was already dressed for the investor brunch, black blazer, no tie, calm, but she saw the tension in his shoulders. "What is it?" she asked. He held up a simple card, an invitation. "Callan sent this," Lennox said. "An event?" "He's stepping down, officially, hosting a transition announcement. Wants me there?" She raised an eyebrow. "Do you want to go?" "I don't know," he said. "But maybe I should." He did go. But not for Callan. He went for the people watching. For the silent kids in the crowd who might have grown up like him, forgotten, dismissed, invisible. When Lennox stepped onto the rooftop where the press were gathered, Callan blinked. The old man had grayed more. But he stood straighter when Lennox appeared. For the first time in 25 years, they shook hands publicly. A silent truce. Callan gave his speech, thanked his team, spoke about the next chapter, then gestured toward Lennox. "A new generation leads differently," Callan said. "And sometimes they lead better." There was no applause line, but there was silence, and sometimes silence is louder than any cheer. Afterward, Lennox didn't linger. He stepped aside, avoided press questions, and walked to the edge of the rooftop. Callan followed quietly. "Was it too much to ask you to come?" he asked. Lennox looked ahead. "You didn't ask. You just expected." Callan nodded once. "I didn't know what else to do." "That's the thing," Lennox replied. "You never did." They stood like that, the skyline behind them. Then Callan did something unexpected. He took out an envelope. "This is yours. No catch. It's not about control. It's something I should have given you when you were born." Lennox took the envelope. Inside was a handwritten document. It was a deed to a modest property in Harlem, one Callan had purchased decades ago and never touched. "I bought it after you were born," he said. "Never knew why I kept it." Lennox didn't thank him. He just nodded. "I'll turn it into a learning space," he said, "for the next kids like me." Callan blinked hard. Then he whispered, "That would have made your mother proud." 2 months later, the space opened. A humble brownstone, retrofitted into a mentorship house, free workshops, career guidance, business incubation, meals served with care. They named it the Serafina House, not the Lennox Center, because legacy wasn't about proving a name. It was about honoring a presence. The day it opened, Serafina walked through the front door and stopped in place. Tears welled in her eyes before she could speak. Kids were laughing in the back room. Music played gently in the garden. And on one wall, etched into glass, were words Lennox had written. She raised a man who never had to destroy to succeed. At Ray Capital, Lennox eventually stepped down as CEO, but stayed on as chair. He traveled more, spoke at fewer conferences, wrote in the early mornings. He never flaunted wealth, never bragged. But people followed him anyway, because his story wasn't about vengeance. It was about values. Callan spent his later years in upstate New York, quietly working on a memoir he never published. He visited the Serafina House once, didn't announce himself, just sat quietly in the back while a young girl presented her first business pitch. He smiled when she finished and whispered, "That was better than anything I ever built." He left without a word. Lennox never changed his last name. He didn't need to, because he had changed the meaning of it. If this story moved you, even for a moment, don't leave without telling us in the comments. Would you have kept the secret like Serafina? Would you have handled success like Lennox? Let's talk about it. And if you believe real strength is quiet, patient, and purposeful, tap that like button. Subscribe to Mr. Charles Stories for more powerful tales that honor the quiet, fighters, the late bloomers, and the ones who rebuild without revenge. We post stories like this every week, True power isn't loud, it shows up in legacy. Join the family. We're building something real here.